Okay, Shabbat Shalom. When I was growing up, my dad had a Yiddish expression. He didn't speak that much Yiddish, but a few words here and there. It was an expression I learned when I was a kid. The difference between essen and fressen is a blessing. Anybody hear that before? Yeah. Okay, so in German, and Yiddish is mostly from German, essen is what human beings do. They eat, but it's human eating. Fressen is a German word for eating, but specifically for animals. Right? So the difference between humans eating, essen, and animals eating, fressen, is a blessing. That is, you say a blessing before and after you eat the food, and that's how you indicate you're not just an animal satisfying an animal need. Also, sometimes if you're eating kind of hastily and stuffing your mouth with a lot of food and overeating, sometimes they call that fressen, even if you're human. Anyway, the story of creation in Genesis tells us that God said before he created human beings, let us make humans in our image. And it's often asked, who is God talking to when he says that? Who is God talking to when he says, let us make humans in our image? Of course, if you're a Christian, you read that verse and you say, of course, it's the Trinity, right? It's the Trinity talking to themselves. But that's not the obvious meaning of the text. And since we don't have a Trinity in the Jewish tradition, that's obviously not how we interpret the text. So what do we say about it? Well, one way to interpret it, which I thought was modern until I found it in a 12th century commentary, is that God was talking to the only other creatures that existed at the time, and those were all the other animals that he had created. So he says to the animals, let's create another being that's kind of like you and kind of like me, right? So that's why human beings are in fact animals. We have physical forms that resemble other animals in the world, but we have something in addition, something that's divine, something godlike as part of us, and that is our spirituality, our intellect, our ability to make conscious moral choices and decisions, and our ability to experience life on a higher plane of awareness, we believe, than animals do. That's what makes us specially human, and that's what makes us similar to the divine presence. So Judaism is a religion that is focused on laws and commandments. And the reason we do that is we want to structure our religious life around these rules that help us to live that holy life that God intended humans to live, to remind us of the things that make us unique in the animal kingdom, to teach us to make choices in our lives, to teach us to make moral decisions, and to restrict our base desires to support life and growth and goodness in the world. So let's get back to essen and fressen then. What is the difference in eating between humans and animals? What are the things that Judaism commands us to do that distinguishes our eating from animal eating? And the first, of course, is, as the Yiddish expression says, we say a blessing before we eat food. We pause for a moment to recognize our Creator, who created all this wonderful food for us to eat and sustains all of life on the planet. And of course, we remind ourselves that we are God's partners in preserving this lush environment that he gave us. And we do that. I like to point this out to people. Sometimes they ask Rabbi to say a blessing before the meal, even in ecumenical settings, interfaith settings. And I say, well, you know, the Jewish blessing before we eat, everybody knows this, hamotzi lechem min haaretz. It's a phrase actually found in the Psalms. But it says, God, we're thanking God for hamotzi, taking out, lechem, bread, min haaretz, from the earth, that God took bread out of the earth. But of course, bread doesn't grow on trees. Bread doesn't grow out of the ground. What grows out of the ground is wheat. And we have to plant the wheat, we have to tend the crops, we have to harvest the crop, we have to grind the grain, we have to mix it with other ingredients to make dough, let it rise, put it in the oven, and bake it. It's a lot of work. God didn't do all of that. We did that. So when we say hamotzi lechem min haaretz, thanking God for bringing bread out of the ground, we are acknowledging our role as God's agents in taking the gifts of the world and transforming them into something better. So that's the blessing we recite before we eat. We also, as many of you know, wash our hands ritually before we eat. Not with soap and water. I mean, you should wash your hands with soap and water as well to make sure you're hygienically clean. But we do the washing as a ritual thing to be spiritually clean. And this reminds us of the priests in the temple who used to wash their hands ritually before they ate their holy food. So when we imitate the priests who wash their hands by washing our hands before we eat, we are saying what we're doing is not just an animal act, it's a holy act. All food is holy, and we are preparing ourselves to eat holy food that God gave us. So washing our hands is the second thing we do. The third thing we do is we distinguish what kinds of food we can eat and what kinds of food we don't eat. Kashrut. It's all about, and kashrut is really about restricting our appetite for meat, for the kinds of animals we can eat. As you know, for each of the different kinds of animals, those that live in the air, those that live in the water, and those that live on land, each kind of animal, we are restricted to only a small subset of those kinds of animals that we're allowed to eat in the first place. That restriction reminds us that we're human beings and we make choices in life. We can choose what we're going to eat and not eat. And we separate then the meat from the dairy because the meat represents, unfortunately, a dead animal. And milk represents life. It's the ultimate nourishment that a mother gives her children. And so we say it's unseemly to celebrate life and milk at the same time we're eating an animal who has died. So all the laws of kashrut, are teaching us about the sanctity of life, even animal life on the planet. And again, it's a reminder that we are distinct from other animals. We can make choices about what we eat and what it means to us. And finally, the long blessing is the grace after the meals, right? Birkat Hamazon, which means blessing of the food. One of my teachers told me that the short blessing, Hamotzi Lechem min haaretz, comes before we eat because we're anxious to eat. You're probably thinking that now. You're saying, when are we going to have lunch? Right? So we're anxious to eat. We don't want to take a long time saying a blessing before we eat. So we have a short one-sentence blessing. But after we eat, we're not hungry, we're not starving. We have a little more time, we can relax. Take a little more time to thank and praise God. And so the Birkat Hamazon is a much longer blessing. The source for doing Birkat Hamazon comes from the Torah portion this morning, and I promised you I was going to read you some passages from the Torah portion we did not read this morning, just the chapter before, 2 chapters before what we read. So the commandment is in the Bible. If you want to follow, it's on page 1041 of the Red Books. It's chapter 8 of Deuteronomy, verse 10, and it says, "When you have eaten your fill, you will give thanks to the Lord your God for the good land which he has given you." You will eat your fill and then give thanks to God. The Birkat Hamazon, the grace after the meal. The Hebrew verse for this is actually quoted in the Birkat Hamazon itself. Ve'achalta v'savata uverachta et Adonai Elohecha al haaretz hatova asher natan lach. You will eat and you will be satisfied and you will bless the Lord your God for the land, the good land, and for all that he has given you. Now I want to read the context for it because the context is important. So it says, "For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land with streams and springs and fountains, issuing from plains and hills, a land of wheat, barley, vines," that's grapes, "figs and pomegranates, a land of olive trees and honey." Those are the 7 species that are known special to Israel. So it's wheat, barley, grapes, figs, pomegranates, olives, and honey. And since honey doesn't seem to fit with the others, those are all fruits and vegetables growing out of the ground. Honey comes from bees. So many Bible scholars say it's not talking about bee honey. It's talking about date honey. Because otherwise, 2 problems. First of all, it doesn't fit with the other ones that are all fruits. And secondly, how can you leave dates out of the special trees that grow in Israel? Dates are all over the place in Israel. So you can't leave dates out. So clearly this honey must refer to date honey. Silan in the store. If you go buy Ceylon, it's a special kind of honey made from dates. Okay, so it's a land flowing with all these different kinds of fruits and vegetables, a land where you may eat food without stint. It's going to give you everything you need. You will lack nothing, a land where rocks are iron, so you'll be able to make implements, whose hills you can mine copper, so you'll have lots of raw materials. And then it says, when you have eaten your fill, you will give thanks to the Lord for the good land which he has given you. Then it says, take care lest you forget the Lord your God and fail to keep his commandments, fail to do those things which identify us as human beings, making choices, moral choices about how to live our lives, being aware of the beauty that surrounds us. If you don't keep these commandments and rules and laws that he's given you today, when you have eaten your fill and you've built fine houses to live in, and your herds and flocks have multiplied, and your silver and gold has increased, and everything you own has prospered, beware lest your heart grow haughty and you forget the Lord your God, who freed you from the land of Egypt, the house of bondage, who led you through the great and terrible wilderness with its fiery serpents and scorpions, a parched land with no water in it, who brought forth water from you from a flinty rock and fed you in the wilderness with manna, which your fathers had never known. You're going to forget all that, and you're going to say to yourselves, my own power and my own might, the might of my own hand, has won this wealth for me. Remember, it is the Lord your God who gives you the power to get wealth in fulfillment of the covenant that he made on oath to your ancestors. It is human nature that when we build our impressive homes and we live in big cities set apart from too much nature, and we acquire lots of things, and we become important in the human world, it's human nature to start thinking of ourselves as self-made men and women. But as Mark Twain once quipped, a self-made man is about as likely as a self-laid egg. The Torah portion reminds us that while it is true that hard work, diligence, and effort often bring material rewards in life, we still owe everything to God. We are God's partners in improving the world. No doubt we can and do benefit from the partnership in material as well as spiritual ways. But we must remember that we're the junior partners. God has provided all of the raw materials, the wealth of the universe, as well as the creative, intellectual, and inspirational attributes of our human abilities. He's given us an amazing intelligence, a powerful drive to achieve and to persevere, to overcome obstacles, and he has given us a unique body design, including the ability to stand upright so we can use our arms to manipulate the world around us, and opposable thumbs that help us to do that. In short, nothing we do or have ever done or ever will do could have happened without God's contribution to our success. And that's why when we enjoy the fruits of our labor, we're duty-bound to use our wealth and resources as God would have us do, wisely and for the improvement of humanity. And we must also thank God who ultimately made it all possible. The difference between Essen and Fressen is a blessing and a whole lot more. The difference between animals eating to satisfy their hunger and human eating is our ability to recognize God's grace in our lives and to recognize that we are God's partners in caring for the wonderful world that he gave us. Shabbat Shalom. And now we're going to rise for Chatzi Kaddish, page 184.